In the bustling streets of 18th century London, life was far from easy for the poor. Children and young servants were often sent to work in the homes of wealthier families, desperate to earn their keep and avoid the misery of the streets. But behind the closed doors of some houses, unimaginable horrors lurked. Among the darkest of these stories is that of Elizabeth Brownrigg, a midwife who gained infamy not for saving lives, but for the terrible cruelty she inflicted upon the helpless young girls. Under her care, Elizabeth Brownrigg was born into obscurity, and little is known about her early life. What history does record is her rise in London as a respected midwife, someone who was supposed to help mothers through childbirth and care for infants. To outsiders, she seemed like a woman of responsibility and authority, a figure who had earned trust in her community. Yet beneath this facade of respectability, she was hiding a sadistic cruelty that would eventually make her one of the most reviled women in England's history. During the 1760s, it was common for orphan girls or young servants from poor families to be apprenticed to households where they would work in exchange for food, shelter, and basic training. Elizabeth and her husband took in such girls under the guise of providing them a place to live and teaching them useful household skills. For many of these children, it seemed like an opportunity to escape starvation. But instead of safety, they entered a house of horrors. Inside Brownrigg's home, the walls themselves seemed to absorb the cries of suffering. The young girls were stripped of their dignity from the moment they entered. Elizabeth imposed her dominance with chains and shackles, chaining her apprentices naked to beams in the cellar, or locking them in confined spaces where they were left for days on end. Food was withheld as punishment, turning starvation into a daily reality. But hunger was not the worst of their suffering. Elizabeth Brownrigg took a perverse pleasure in physical torment. She wielded whips, sticks, and canes against the bare skin of her apprentices, leaving them bloodied and broken. Their small bodies became canvases of bruises, open wounds, and scars that never healed. If one of them dared to resist or cried loudly, the punishment only worsened. She seemed to feed off their helplessness, her cruelty escalating with each act of defiance or moment of weakness. What made Brownrigg's actions even more horrific was her calculated control. She was not a woman driven by sudden bursts of anger. Instead, she orchestrated the torture with methodical precision. The girls were forced into silence, stripped of all human comfort, and deprived of clothing so that the beatings would leave maximum damage. It was not just violence, it was domination, humiliation, and destruction of the spirit. Word of the girls. Suffering might never have reached the outside world if not for one of the victims who managed to escape. Covered in bruises and half-starved, the girl stumbled into the street, where her condition horrified those who saw her. Her story, whispered in shock through the neighborhoods of London, became impossible to ignore. Soon, authorities were alerted, and suspicions began to grow about what was happening behind Brownrigg's doors. When officials finally entered the house, they were met with a scene of unspeakable cruelty. Chained to a beam was another young girl, her body covered in wounds, her strength nearly gone. The smell of decay, the marks of starvation, and the bloodstains on the floor told the story even before the victims could speak. Investigators uncovered multiple apprentices who had endured prolonged abuse, each one bearing evidence of Brownrigg's sadism. Among the most tragic of her victims was Mary Clifford, a young apprentice who had endured some of the worst punishments. She had been chained for days, without food, lashed until her skin tore, and forced to lie in filth. The torment eventually proved too much for her frail body, and she died as a result of the abuse. Her death became the final piece of evidence that sealed Elizabeth Brownrigg's fate. News of the case spread rapidly through London, igniting outrage among the public. The city was no stranger to crime or cruelty, but the deliberate torture and murder of innocent young girls by a woman who was supposed to be a caregiver struck a deep chord of horror. Newspapers carried lurid accounts of the discoveries in her house, and soon Elizabeth Brownrigg was known across the country as a monster disguised in the clothing of a midwife. The trial that followed was swift and decisive. The court heard testimony from the surviving apprentices, who recounted the endless nights of terror, the brutal beatings, and the hopelessness they felt under her roof. Their stories painted a picture of a household transformed into a dungeon. Witnesses described the injuries in graphic detail, leaving no doubt about the scale of the abuse. The evidence was overwhelming, and there was little room for mercy for the people of London. The trial was not just about punishing one cruel woman, it was about sending a message. Apprentices and servants were already among the most vulnerable members of society, and the idea that someone could exploit and torture them with such impunity was intolerable. By making Brownrigg an example, the authorities sought to reassure the public that such crimes would not be ignored. When the verdict came, it was unanimous. Elizabeth Brownrigg was guilty of murder and sentenced to death. The punishment would be carried out in the most public of ways, as was customary in 18th century England. Public executions were not merely acts of justice, they were spectacles meant to terrify and warn. And for a crime as notorious as Brownrigg's, the crowd that gathered to witness her fate was immense. As the day of execution approached, anticipation ran high. People from all over London flocked to Tyburn, the infamous site of public hangings. They came not only to see justice done, but also to lay their eyes on the woman whose cruelty had shocked the entire nation. Elizabeth Brownrigg, once a midwife respected for her role in bringing new life into the world, was now condemned as the embodiment of evil, a figure who had betrayed every expectation of compassion and care. Her execution was intended to be both justice and spectacle. To the victims and their families, it was a moment of vindication. Though no punishment could ever truly erase the horrors they had endured, to the public, it was a grim reminder of how wickedness could hide behind a mask of respectability. And to history, it was the sealing of Elizabeth Brownrigg's legacy not as a caregiver, but as London's most evil woman. But Elizabeth Brownrigg's arrogance became her undoing. She believed she was untouchable, that the silence of her victims and the indifference of London would forever protect her. Yet one girl, Mary Clifford, refused to surrender quietly to her fate. Despite her frail body, covered in sores and wounds, she tried to escape whenever Elizabeth loosened her chains. On one desperate occasion, Mary dragged herself to a window, her weak voice calling out for help. Neighbors who heard her cries grew suspicious. The whispers that had once been ignored now grew louder, spreading through the streets of Clerkenwell. Elizabeth's home, once hidden behind the facade of a respectable midwife, was now under the gaze of a city beginning to stir. Authorities finally intervened. When officials entered the house, the horrors they uncovered defied belief. The smell of rot filled the air. In the dim light, they found Mary Clifford near death, chained, her body little more than skin clinging to bone, marked with deep lash wounds that never had the chance to heal. Her voice was so faint that those present leaned in close just to hear her recount the torment. Another girl, almost unrecognizable as human, lay motionless in a corner, her life extinguished by the same hands. The shocking discovery spread like fire through London. For the first time, Elizabeth Brownrigg could not hide behind the respectability of her profession or the ignorance of society. She was arrested, along with her husband and son, at trial. The details were laid bare before horrified onlookers. Witnesses described the daily cruelty, the deliberate starvation, and the savage beatings that went far beyond punishment and into the realm of sadistic obsession. Mary Clifford's testimony, delivered in a voice trembling but unbroken, painted Elizabeth as a monster hiding behind the mask of a midwife. The court did not hesitate. Elizabeth Brownrigg was sentenced to death by hanging. But unlike many criminals whose fates went unnoticed, hers would become a spectacle. On the day of her execution in 1767, thousands gathered at Tyburn. Men, women, and children alike wanted to see the downfall of the woman now called London as most evil. The crowd seethed with a mixture of disgust and fascination, waiting to witness the final moment of justice. As Elizabeth was led to the scaffold, her once proud demeanor faltered. No longer the tyrant within her home, she appeared small and fearful in the face of death. The very society that once turned away from her crimes now demanded her life. Bound and standing before the crowd, she trembled as the noose was tightened around her neck. Moments later, Elizabeth Brownrigg swung lifelessly, the jeers of the mob echoing in her final moments. Her body was not treated with dignity. Instead, it was taken for public dissection, her flesh and bones serving as a grim warning of what awaited those who committed crimes so heinous. Londoners, once blind to the suffering of young servants, now carried with them the memory of her name as symbol of cruelty and corruption. The story of Elizabeth Brownrigg lingers not only as a tale of torture and death, but as a chilling reminder of how society itself can foster monsters. When it turns a blind eye to suffering, the young girls she destroyed were forgotten by many, their names fading into history. But her crimes left an imprint so dark that it continues to echo centuries later. She became the embodiment of evil hidden in plain sight, a woman who turned her home into a torture house and left behind a legacy of horror. Even now, her name still sparks unease in London's crime history. The house is long gone, the chains removed, but the whispers remain. A midwife who betrayed her duty to heal, and instead became an architect of suffering. Elizabeth Brownrigg's story is not just about cruelty, it is about the terrifying possibility that the most dangerous monsters are often the ones who seem most ordinary. If you found the story chilling, don't forget to subscribe for more tales of dark history and forgotten horrors. Share this with those who dare to know the truth about humanity's darkest corners. And join us next time as we uncover another story that will haunt your thoughts long after the video ends.